Submit everyone. Good evening. I am Chasiti Walker, the Community Initiatives Coordinator of HGO Co., the Community and Learning Initiative of Houston Grand Opera.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Johnson, Houston Grand Opera's dramaturg, the resident opera nerd for the company.
And we've teamed up to bring you a new digital program for the 21 to 22 season. What if?
This program is designed to set up a larger context for some of our main stage productions with support from an expert in the field and an artist from the show. And then we turn it around and we ask you, our audience, what if?
And today, we bring you the third episode of What If, which will focus on Poulenc's Dialogues of the Carmelites. This program is a part of the Seeking the Human Spirit, a 6-year multidisciplinary initiative designed to highlight the universal spiritual themes raised in opera and to expand and deepen Houstonians' connections to opera and art.
Dialogues of the Carmelites, Poulenc's tragedy in 3 acts originally, and our production will be in 2 parts, is based on the true story of the martyrs of Compiègne, a community of Carmelite nuns, 16 of whom were guillotined during the French Revolution's reign of terror. It is one of the few operas from the 20th century to have made it into kind of the standard repertoire, still holding its place in the repertoire, and many hold it in high esteem as one of the 20th century's greatest operas. And just for me personally, I think I would definitely put it in my top 10 for me. Our first guest tonight is religious studies specialist, David L. Gitomer, Associate Professor of Religious Studies, as well as Director of the Master of Arts in Liberal Studies and Interdisciplinary Studies programs at DePaul University. Welcome, David, and also accept my apologies if I mispronounce your last name. We were on beforehand, and I always ask that question, and I realized as I was getting to it that I didn't ask that question before we went live.
Right. Well, Gitomer is how we say it in this country. It's originally the name of a small city in Ukraine called Gitomer, but we say Gitomer here.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome, Professor Gitomer.
Thank you.
Could we just start off with a little bit about you? Tell us a little bit about where you're from, your area of specialty, where you teach, a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'm a professor of religious studies at DePaul University. My specialty is actually ancient India. I'm a Sanskrit scholar, and my work is on literature and drama. But because I know Sanskrit, I know a lot about Hinduism and Buddhism. And because of that, I got hired to teach religious studies. I am a religion nerd. I also have a theater background. I worked in the public theater in New York. I ran props at Shakespeare in the Park, at Delacorte, while I was a graduate student. And actually, most of my publications are about Sanskrit drama. And while I was a graduate student in New York, I went to the Met almost every week. I paid my $5 and I stood in the back. And I developed a great love of opera while I was becoming a scholar of ancient India. So all of these things fit together. Personally, I call myself a Jewish, Catholic, Hindu, Buddhist. I have connections to all those traditions. So this opera is very, very meaningful to me. It was actually one of the first that I saw at the Met. And I've seen it about 10 times. I love it. It's still yielding new meanings to me.
Fantastic. So a Sanskrit scholar, a religious studies scholar, and a big lover of opera. And we got in touch with you, actually. We kind of found you through an article that you wrote. And it's a great article, and we'll have to find a way. I'm sure Chasiti and Emily will be able to find a way to share that article with all of our guests here tonight. a great article kind of dissecting martyrdom in the context of art, and then kind of talk specifically about Dialogues of the Carmelites. So I want to kind of to break through a little bit of that and then kind of talk that into context. So let's start with, because you talk about the etymology. So talk a little bit about the etymology and meaning of martyrdom as witness to faith.
Yeah, well, you've actually pretty much said it. The word martyr is the Greek word for witness. And like a lot of terminology in early Christianity, we'll start with Christianity, it actually comes from financial and legal terminology. So you'll find the Greek of the New Testament filled with words that come from the Greco-Roman legal and financial world. So we know what a witness is, right? But specifically, this is someone whose words or actions testify to the truth. And in almost every religious tradition, at least the ones that I know of, it is connected with self-sacrifice. In other words, the ultimate form of witness is a self-sacrifice. So there's kind of a spectrum of witnessing, and at the very end of which is the sacrifice of the self. So this is a universal idea in religion. In Islam, we have the word shahid, which means witness and martyr, both together. Gandhi has the term from Hinduism, satyagraha, and you know that's the name of an opera also, which means truth force. And Gandhi thought that witnessing to the truth might involve self-sacrifice through passive resistance, nonviolent passive resistance. After World War II, as Jewish theologians were trying to come up with a way to understand the unbelievable event of 6 million Jews being killed, they were trying to find a theological meaning for it. They borrowed the term Holocaust from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, which means it's a kind of an offering, kind of a sacrifice to God. It's a wholly consumed offering, one in which the sacrificial object, the sacrificial victim, if it be a lamb, is completely burned up and offered to God rather than being partly burned up and shared by the community, which is the typical form of sacrifice. And then we can think of Tibetan monks, and before that, Vietnamese monks who immolated themselves as an act of protest against the authoritarian government. I'll come back to the political implications in a minute. So of course, in Christianity, Jesus is regarded as the first martyr. He died in the New Testament understanding so that his followers wouldn't die. That was the simple meaning of it. And I'll come back to that with one of your other questions to come. But then the Apostle Paul came along and he added a new meaning to it. And this was the idea of atonement through replacement. In other words, we've all heard this cliche, Jesus died for your sins, or Jesus died for sinful humanity. That idea is not in the Gospels, but the Apostle Paul saw that humanity was sinful because of his idea of original sin, and that to redeem, the same way, again, language from finance, the way that you might redeem something you left in a pawn shop, Paul had this idea that Jesus redeemed humanity through allowing himself to be killed. The early Christian martyrs drew on that idea, and they saw their own self-sacrifice as being connected with Christ's self-sacrifice. And this is an idea which we find very, very strongly in the opera, both in the death of Madame Croissy, the first prioress, I'll come back to that, that she suffers in order to make Sœur Blanche, the suffering of Sœur Blanche, easy and light, which is an idea that a lot of people don't focus on, but it's very much in the opera. And then the second idea is the political idea that the Carmelites as a community are making the ultimate sacrifice self-sacrifice for the sins of France. So martyrdom always has a political meaning because it pushes back against the power of the state. Authoritarian states always try to suppress other sources of power, such as the source of power which abides in religious movements and religious communities. Certainly the French Revolution, the period of the French Revolution that we call the Reign of Terror, was an instance of state hysteria, a state that was out of control. Now, of course, we have to acknowledge the Catholic Church was in bed with the monarchy, right? So it was very natural, and we see this in the opera, that when the monarchy is being brought down by the Reign of Terror, by the revolution, they're going to bring down the church with it. And interestingly, many of the revolutionaries who died fighting the monarchy and fighting the church, they called themselves martyrs as well. So it's a little bit of irony there.
Yeah. Would they have been raised and or practicing Catholics prior to having started the revolution?
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing. That's a great point, because there is a Catholic template in the revolutionary mindset, right? So, and we see this. We could also talk about how people think about dying for their country. That's a kind of martyrdom too, right? When people go to war and they say, I'm dying for my country, that is self-sacrifice for others. And in a minute, I know you're going to ask me about martyrdom and suicide. So there's a little way into that right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I've noticed that you used the term self-sacrifice, and I'm going to assume that was a very purposeful choice of words based on the question I'm about to ask you. So in your article on artistic representations of Christian martyrdom, you reference Durkheim's third type of suicide, the altruistic suicide for the good of the community. I know there are actually probably, I think, quite a few people who are in our HGO book club, where we recently discussed the Fon Lefort Song of the Scaffold. And we had a very interesting and compelling conversation about martyrdom versus suicide. So just want to get your thoughts on that. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, I think we have to admit, now that we have in the 21st century a more nuanced understanding of kind of multiple motivations, that we can't always make a clear boundary between a desire to witness to the truth, a depression, individual depression, psychological depression that's caused by social, economic, or political misery. We've seen in the pandemic, some people have been so miserable that they felt suicidal, and they weren't necessarily suicidal before the pandemic, right?
This is a Catholic priest.
And then the third thing would be personal mental health challenges. So we can't always make a clear-cut distinction between those three things: a desire to witness to the truth, depression that's caused by external circumstances, and personal mental health challenges. But generally, we could say that that martyrdom is meant to be a sacrifice for others, and isn't primarily a framework for ending one's life due to personal misery. Let's think about the idea of dying for a cause, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who are listening to me talk who are thinking, well, I'm not religious, so this martyrdom thing is like for the birds. But if you think about the fact that when Jesus said in John 15, greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends. We've all heard that, right? Some people might not even know that it comes from the Gospel of John, but Jesus didn't make that up. That was a Roman military proverb. That was something that soldiers said to each other, and that when you were being propagandized, so to speak, to be a soldier, you would hear this saying over and over and over again. So Jesus used it because people knew what it meant, but of course he was using it in a different sense. So if you aren't religious and you don't respond to the idea of a greater religious truth, you can probably think of scenarios where people will sacrifice themselves for their friends, for their loved ones, for their way of living, which often happens in war. Now, suicide. Okay, if you're an opera lover, you know about suicide. That is the classic opera ending. People who are disappointed in love or are betrayed in love or are, something happens. I think about every other Verdi opera. I can think about most of the bel canto operas where there's either a suicide of some sort at the end. But is this suicide for other people? No. It's because one is so miserable and has not been able to love. And interestingly, the source for that also has an opera connection. The very first time that we see this in early modern Western literature is in Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, which Massenet in 1892 turned into an opera called Werther. And if you think about the ending of Werther, this young poet who falls in love with this woman, Charlotte, and she gets married to this very conventional guy. And so he can't have her. He shoots himself, right? That is suicide. That is not martyrdom. So I think, we can think about these different, the familiar opera stories that we know, and we can see pretty clearly what the difference is between wanting to end one's life because of personal misery and wanting to make a sacrifice that you believe, anyway, not everybody else will, that you believe is for the greater good.
Mm-hmm. Well, so talk about the idea of altruistic suicide. Well,
I guess, the best example we can think of is the military one where, a group of fighters are going in and, a grenade is tossed. And, we've seen in all these war movies where the guy falls on the grenade, right? And gets blown up so that, 10 other guys can live.
Mm-hmm.
So, that is a very clear idea of altruism. We also find that, sometimes people work themselves to death for the sake of their children or their families. It might not be a dramatic suicide, but it might be a kind of burning oneself out for the sake of others. So I think, there's lots of examples of that. Does that make sense that those things are altruistic?
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of have a side follow-up question on that. So it seems just kind of, A and B and C, it seems to me that, not all suicides are martyrs, but are all martyrs a type of suicide? How would you go there, or would you say not at all because it's on behalf of someone else?
I would say as a religious studies scholar, I would go back to what I said in the beginning. We can't always separate out. And I get one of the questions that comes up was, was Sir Blanche this hysterical young woman who just went over the top? And I think there are things in the opera that argue against that. I think it's possible externally to make that interpretation. Certainly, when we look at some of the suicide bombers in recent conflicts, we can we can stand outside of their framework and we can say, oh, these are aimless young men. And this is something that gives meaning to their lives. Because their lives have no meaning, they don't have any trouble ending their lives. But I would say, I would want to argue that this is very different from vowed religious women who have a really tough life and who actually, as Madame Croissy tells Sister Blanche, you don't come into the monastery to, for protection by the convent. it's your job to protect the convent. So you are on the front lines of this. That's not something for weak people. That's something for strong people. You know, I think it's partly a matter of terminology, but I think also I think it is possible by looking at motivation and context to make a fairly good distinction between a personal act of sacrifice to end personal misery and a type of sacrifice which is intended for the greater good. Now, I think the problem in religion for non-religious people is that this greater good might not be seen by other people as a greater good. So, you know, you could say, okay, 16 nuns allowed themselves to be guillotined. Well, certainly Sister Blanche did, because she ran away. She didn't have to come forward, but she did. But there is this idea of a witness being a sign of the presence of God, if you believe in God, being the sign of a greater reality, being the sign, if you're a Christian, of Christ's teaching of love. And I think this is true in other religions, true, that making the ultimate sacrifice is a sign of that you believe and that you would like others to believe in the truth of the faith that you know personally.
It's so interesting. I want to go back to what you said earlier about how what Blanche is doing takes a lot of strength to protect the convent. Because we get that in the poetry in the Poulenc opera, you know, how her family thinks she's being weak, and you know, she's giving in, she's hiding, you know, she's leaving the world out of spite, her father says in the first scene, and then later her brother comes in and visits her at kind of the height of the reign of terror, right when it's starting, I mean, and starting to say, you know, we're worried for your safety here, you know, and she thinks you think I stay here out of fear, and he says, no, you're fear of fear. And then she says that line about how and Natalya's on here in the background, she could probably pick it right up for me, about how she says, you know, my battle is just as courageous as your battle is, you know, see me as your companion in battle. And
yes, but now I'm going to say something which I think might be a little contrarian here.
No, please.
If, you know, and this relates to the question that you had posed to me about the end of the opera, where we see the scaffold, and in a few minutes, you know, as they're singing the Salve Regina, we're going to hear the slice of that, you know, those 16 slices. And I always wonder when I listen to recordings why the slices aren't louder. And I don't know whether this is a production issue or whether Poulenc really wanted the music to overpower the sound of the guillotine, which would just make it into a kind of like a horror show, which it's not. But let's go back a couple of scenes in the final act. Blanche has run away, and Mère Marie finds her in the devastated mansion, castle she grew up in. Her brother's been exiled, or is in exile. Her father's been guillotined. The house is destroyed. She's been turned into a servant. Servant comes in and says, do this, do that. And Mère Marie comes in and says, hey, it's time. You know, we're all doing this. You come and join us. And she says, I just want to be left alone. I'm afraid. Just leave me in peace. I wrote it down here. She says, first she says, I want to be left in peace. I don't want anybody to think of me anymore. And then she gets really angry. And the stage direction says, with immeasurable violence. And she says, what can I be blamed for? What harm have I done? I haven't offended God. Fear doesn't offend God. She's wrong. I was born in fear. I lived in fear. I still live in fear. The whole world has contempt for fear. So it's only right that I should live in contempt, meaning that I should be an object of contempt. I've thought this way for a long time. And then Mère Marie leaves. The next thing is we have this wordless interlude where she's scurrying around the Bastille, and the two old people say, well, what's going on at Compiègne? And she says, I've never been to Compiègne. This is like the Apostle Peter saying, you know, when they in the garden saying, did you know him? Oh, I never met this guy, Jesus. So what happens next? We're at the guillotine, and suddenly she appears. She's calm, she's serene, she's ready to go to her end. So the question that I have about the opera is theological and psychological. I'd love to hear what Natalya says about this, because we don't see any personal growth, personal psychological growth. We don't see her struggle. We see her saying, I'm too afraid to do this. I can't do this. And you know, God doesn't mind fear. But the whole idea is and this was another question you asked, you don't seek martyrdom. But if martyrdom is presented to you, you accept it. So something has happened, and I very strongly think that both for Poulenc, because he experienced his own kind of atonement, and for Bernanos, they intended Madame Croissy's miserable death to be the death that Blanche would have had. And Constance says this, right? She says, I got this feeling that why did she die this puny death where she was not only suffering physically, but she lost her faith in God. At the very end, Madame Croissy, she's the prioress, she's the model of the religious life. And she feels abandoned by God, just as Jesus did in the garden. And Constance, who's supposed to be simple and lighthearted, she sees into this. She said, she's dying somebody else's death. And Blanche says, well, what's that? You know, what a ridiculous idea. How can you die for somebody else? Which of course is the central paradigm of Christianity. And so the last thing we see her, you know, in fear, saying she's afraid, and then denying that she has anything to do with Compiègne. And then in the very last scene, she's radiant, transformed, ready to accept death. And it's easy for her. And I think it's because of Madame Croissy's miserable death.
That's so interesting. Yeah, she walks so freely and unforced. You know, she wasn't arrested, she wasn't there. But yeah, she's dying on behalf. I'd love to quickly bring Natalya on.
Can I just say one more thing? You had asked about Francesca Zamballa's interpretation, but that's what the stage direction says. Mm-hmm. The stage direction says her face free of all fear, she clears a path through the crowd where she's been mingling incredibly calmly. She emerges from the astonished crowd and mounts the scaffold. So Bernanos and Poulenc are telling us this. You know, it's not just the director's interpretation.
Yeah. So, which is very different from the Fond le Fort and how that's presented in the original book, because this was kind of a theological twist that Bernanos brings in, the dying on behalf of someone else.
Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. I'd love to, before I turn it over to Chasiti, I just want to real quick just get Natalya's reaction to all that. I'd love to just hear you with David.
Yeah, it's been like so interesting to listen to you talk, David, about it, because you're so right. Actually, while I was listening to you saying, where is the growth in Blanche's character? Like, how does she get from one scene to the other? That's something that I struggle with myself as an actress, because they are sort of freeze frames in time. They're not, I don't really believe that one scene leads directly into the next. And that you have to make up that time in your own mind as an actress, you know, portraying a character who is jumping like mentally way ahead of, you know, what's happened just 30 seconds before. And of course, we're in the context of an opera, that happens. But it is like you get off the stage. I realized, because this is the second time I've played this role. I played it once 10 years ago when I was in college, and I certainly didn't have the sort of the deeper informed knowledge that I have now about it, which is nice. But I still came off the stage last night and I thought to myself, I'm not sure what I achieved there, because it all went so fast, and it's not your usual kind of opera. You have a love duet in it, in context of sort of like aria, love duet, ensemble, blah, blah, blah. There's only one thing that really conforms to the sort of typical architectural sort of journey of an opera, and that is, I guess, the love duet. There are ensembles, but there's nothing that truly explains each character's intricate journey throughout from A to B. And that's something that I kind of realized as you were speaking, is that's what makes it quite difficult, actually, to portray. And why is she so all of a sudden, why does she sort of, she has that scene with Memory who says, your time is now. And she says, no, I just wish that people would leave me alone. And she's kind of in denial. And then the next time we see her, which is only one scene later, she's fine. She's ready to go. She believes that she, whether it be from, the death of the prioress, which has been in exchange of Blanche's death, that she has this peace all of a sudden. And it's quite hard to transition to buy into how, to try to understand it.
I think for me, that makes it both very modern and very pre-modern. In other words, that the libretto and the music almost remove psychology from it in the conventional way we think about development and all of that.
Completely.
I wanted to say something about the very beginning of, not the very beginning, but Blanche's first interview with Madame Croissy, where Madame Croissy says, hey, but by any chance, have you chosen a religious name? Like, I know you're new in this, and like, it's probably way too early. And she said,
the worst interview ever.
I'm going to be Sister Blanche of the Agony of Christ. And here's this woman who is really, has not been in religious life. Like, where is she getting this from? And I think, and Madame Croissy, according to the stage direction, is like, who is this person and where is this coming from?
Oh.
Yeah.
And she's kind of naive, she's romantic, and she comes up with this far-fetched name, but it's also prophetic. But she doesn't have to live it herself, because Madame Croissy realizes what's going to happen, and she takes on this substitute death, substitute martyrdom, very early in the opera. That's how I see it, anyway.
Wow. Thank you so much, David. I hope you're going to stick around for the breakout session so that our audience can talk more to you. We're just digesting so much here. And I want to say thank you, Jeremy, as well. We're going to kind of switch up the tempo a little bit. I know that was a lot of information, great information. So thank you again, David. We're going to talk to Natalya now. We're going to talk more about your artistic process. We got all of the story. We got a lot of background, history, and context. So now we want to kind of talk to you about your personal process and give our audience an insight to that part of this process. So my first question would be, I know you said you did this role back when you were in college, right? 10 years ago.
That's right.
So I guess it doesn't apply quite the same to this role, but how do you approach learning a new role?
Well, the first thing I do as sort of someone who's booked sort of 3 years in advance in normal circumstances where COVID isn't involved, is to think, okay, can I sing this role on the stage? And is it sort of comfortable enough for me, right? Before you accept something. And that's the first thing to decide, because I think the important thing to point out is that, a voice is very capable of singing one role in a room, in a coaching, in a lesson, then feeling it emotionally and sort of like doing the vocal and emotional journey together on the stage, because there's always like an added element of pressure when you come to the stage, even with this role, which for me is it's kind of like one of the easiest roles that I sing in terms of the grand scale of sort of full lyric repertoire. But, you know, there's always something that sort of ignites your, oh gosh, you know, am I okay to do this? So that's the first thing I always think of. The second thing for me to do is always to concentrate on the language first, because the language written by the, you know, these wonderful composers, Poulenc especially, will always write so well for the voice. You know, the language dictates how you sing your pitches. So the language comes first. I'll translate that. I'll translate whatever everyone else is saying to me, so that I know exactly what's going on in the scene and circumstances. And then I'll pair the two together. I will take it to my coaches and coach it well. I like to be off book when I come to the first music rehearsal. In that way, you are well equipped enough to sort of take notes from the music staff, and then when you put it on its feet in the production, it's good to have some sort of preconception yourself, you know, some sort of idea about how you've interpreted the character, but it's also good to not have too concentrated an idea, so that you can be open to the production. In this case, it's a revival, so it kind of has its sort of locked in geography, and you know, whenever someone comes to a role, they're always bringing something new anyway to a character. So I think it's just super important to be open, but to know it well enough that you can sort of, you know, move around it without having to worry about, you know, technical things.
Yeah. So you talked a lot about your own interpretation and what you bring to the character and what's brought to the character through rehearsal process or with the stage director. So my question would be, are there some character choices that are made by the music itself that you just can't get away from?
Yes, definitely. Particularly in this opera, actually, there's some scenes where you can't make sense of them, of the way it's written, unless you are in the state that the composer wanted you to be as the character. For example, when Mère Marie comes in, when Blanche and Constance are supposed to be guarding the coffin of the old prioress, played by Pat Rosett in this production, and leaves, and Blanche, all of a sudden, there's like this ba-dum in the music, and it's anxiety. You know, it's, oh my gosh, I'm alone, I'm on my own. Blanche goes to run away, and Mère Marie comes in and absolutely like cuts across and reprimands her, and it's so well written. And then you have the I was just and it's in the music, you know.
Yeah.
And you can't escape things like that, you know. You have to, the music provokes you to sort of be panicked and breathless, and or, you know, really strong in the duet with her brother, where she says, actually, as David was saying earlier, or Jeremy perhaps, the both of them were having the discussion about how Blanche says eventually to her brother, you know, I see it as the both of us are at war here. We each have our battles, and I would ask you to think of me also as, you know, a fellow soldier who is suffering for you. And there's this sort of what's the word? I can't think of it, but this sort of not triumph. I'm so sorry, I can't really find the word that I'm looking for, but some sort of constance in it, you know. And I think all of it is really provoked by the music. So I think a lot of choices are already made for us. The text and the music.
That's, you know, good to know. And you talked about the text leading you through the story, and it's very, you know, interesting how even the music, those small things like that, you know, that can lead the character. So thank you for telling us that. And then I'm gonna switch this question, going back to some of the things that David talked about. We know that this is a true story, and this actually did happen. And I want to know, when preparing for this role and getting into your character and thinking about those choices and the whys, and you were telling David you don't know how you got from point A to point B, but when you think about the true story, did that influence in any way how you prepared for this role?
Well, it's important to point out that although it is a true story about the martyrs of Compiègne, that Blanche is a fictional character, so there's no truth to her story within the opera. But of course, you know, the fact that she was an aristocratic young girl who went into the Carmelite order, well, I'm certain that is the journey of someone, you know, that happened during the French Revolution, because the aristocracy was very closely related to the church during that time, which is why they were targeted so much, I think. But I think it's always important to know that this is you know, these people did die. They died because they were completely loyal and faithful, and they were just so committed. And I think that that brings, you know, a sense of duty when you approach a role like this. And you know, there isn't one time where we've all done that last scene and it's just silent, you know. The silence sort of overtakes the room. It sort of blankets us, and we know that there is a not so distant memory of this actually happening. And I know with recreating it in theatre, and everything is heightened and not exactly to the point, or you know, but there is truth at the very core of it. And so, you know, there's a lot of respect when it comes to each individual, no matter whether their story be true within the opera. The truth is that, you know, there were 16 nuns, I think, that were beheaded because they refused to leave their religion. You know, they were that committed to it. And you know, Blanche has a choice. You know, she has a choice whether to go or to sort of, you know, to return to her aristocratic life, where, you know, on the surface of things, you know, you'd think, well, surely she was safer there, right? She could have been protected. But I think her journey, her arc is a huge one, which is why I was saying to David, it's quite hard to make that massive transition from the very beginning. All of a sudden, the next thing you see is that she's asking to be accepted into the Carmelite order. And she does the worst job interview that one could ever imagine doing. She says the wrong things to each question that Madame de Croissy asks. And still, there's this connection between the two of them. And we think, actually, you know, in this production, that it's the fact that I have chosen the same name that Croissy had chosen, and that she has this fear of death as well deep within, that sort of connects us. And she says, you know, when she's dying, that of all my daughters, you know, you are the most dearest to me, but also the most hazardous and the hardest to sort of tame, you know. And there's a very deep understanding that is never quite fully explained or even seen within the opera. It's just the words you have to listen to so carefully about, you know, how she feels towards Blanche, really, because Blanche doesn't really exhibit anything about the closeness of their relationship ever. It's hard because, you know, you think some of these you could develop more scenes within the opera, surely, about, you know, what to give more context of perhaps make things clearer, but they are just dialogues. You know, a a really big picture framed into a smaller one with a huge underlying urgency, and the context is very deep. Yeah.
Yeah, very deep. I don't know how much deeper we can get. And I have so many questions, but we're kind of running low on time. So I'm going to ask you one more question.
Mhm.
And that is, what is Blanche's why? Why does she choose to go back and to choose that fate? What was it that made her make that decision?
Well, I think that Constance, aptly named, as Constance, her little friend within the convent there, teaches her so much. She's a simple girl. She's not from the same class as Blanche. She's definitely from a poorer background. She has a very simple outlook on life, and sometimes I feel when one has a simpler outlook on life, things are far more black and white, which is helpful sometimes to people who skirt around the grey areas, which I think Blanche is hugely sort of placed in.
Mm.
And I think it's Constance who teaches her. She's very wise when she says that, the old prioress is as if someone has grabbed the wrong coat from the cloakroom, is what she says. That was the exchange of one death for another. And I think, the lessons that she teaches Blanche throughout the journey that we see, at least, are very profound. And I think that Blanche learns from her hugely. And she ends up being totally committed to the Catholic Church and to the Carmelite order. And I think she knows that when memory comes, that she can't, memory says that, you will meet me at the 2 Rue Saint-Denis. You will come here and that will be your safe place. And Blanche knows that she's not going to do it because I think she wants to die without fear, and in fear comes fear of everything, right? Peur de la peur, which is what we hear a lot during the opera. Fear of everything, fear of dying for the wrong reasons. Blanche was brought into the world by fear. She died when her mum was in distress, giving birth to her. I think she's so tired of fear, and I think she's been taught a little bit how to sort of combat it with the tools that she's sort of learned from her friends, and particularly Constance in the convent there. And I think she is brave in the end. She comes to take the vow with the rest of them, and I think that's her peace that she ends up achieving at the very end. So it's kind of like it's closure for her and respite as well.
Wow. Thank you so much, Natalya, for sharing your insight with us and your artistic journey. And I hope you'll stay for the breakout session so that our audience can have a chance to interact with you and share their thoughts. And I know that a lot of people probably have a lot to say. So now that you have learned more of the dramatic context and story of dialogues of the Carmelites, we are ready to send you into breakout rooms. And your prompt for today's What If is to think about something that you strongly believe in, whether it be religious, political, family values, whatever. If you found yourself in the same position as a Carmelite woman and your beliefs were threatened by governing powers, would you give in and sacrifice your beliefs or choose the same fate of the women in the story? What other choice could you make? Is there any other choice these women could have made? So I'm going to put everyone into breakout rooms, and we're going to give you 15 minutes You're going to take notes. We're all going to come back and we're going to discuss them together.